In this video, I want to create a macro that will highlight whatever cell or cells I've selected and then remove the highlighting when I select another cell. I can do this using the worksheet selection change event, which you get by opening up the sheet object and then selecting worksheet here. And conveniently, the first event I get is the one I need, where whenever I change a selection, that new selection will be the target, which I can then reference using the target keyword. Whenever this macro runs, it won't remember what my previously selected cells were, which is why I need to store that information somewhere. I want to store the row and column in these cells, so I can reference it in the macro. You'd want to store this on a separate sheet, but I'll do it here to make it easier to see in real time. The first time this code runs, I won't have written anything in J1 and K1, so I want to not run the code if there's no information here. I first want to remove the highlighting of my previously selected cell, which I do by reading the value in J1 and K1. I'll say I want to go into the cells, which I get from range J1. Here you could also use a named range if you think that makes it easier to read the code, but I think it's self-explanatory. I want to change the interior.ColorIndex to be equal to 0, which will then make it white, but actually not exactly white, which we'll see later on. Now I've removed the previous highlighting. I can then add highlighting to the current cell by saying active cell. I could also use target here, but it ends up being the same thing. I want this to be interior.color, and I'm just going to copy a blue color, which you could then change to whatever you want. Now the current selected area has been changed, as we can already see. I then want to write in what is the current active cell inside of J1 and K1 before the macro ends. And I choose to store them as numbers because then I can reference it in the cells function, which takes row as a number and column as a number. Now we can already see it in action, and it removes the original highlighting. But if you select multiple cells, it will currently only highlight the top left one, and that's because if we check what the active cell is, its address, we can see it's only the top left cell. But if I pause the macro and just add some highlighting to some cells, we'll see that there actually is a problem here. And that's why I've chosen to call it simple. So now we have some colors. And if I then reactivate the macro, we can see that when I highlight the yellow, it will correctly change the highlighting to a new color, but it actually overwrites the original highlighting and replaces it with white. So I'm not satisfied with that solution because it overwrites existing highlighting. Before going further, I first want to show what's the difference between .color and .ColorIndex, because I'll be using that in this solution. And that's because when you have this cell here that has no background color, that's actually the color of no color and not the color of white. If you want to remove the highlighting, you'd want to say no fill, which is what you normally have in a cell, but you can also change it to be white, which you'll then see that there's no edges here in the formatting because the whole cell has been colored white, and those two aren't the same thing. So actually if I make this white again, if I say active cell.interior.color, it is that color. And if I use ColorIndex, we'll see it has an index of 2. If I then select a normal cell with no highlighting and no color and run the same code, we'll see I get the same interior.color because the interior color is white, but this cell has edges, whereas the color index is -4142. In order to retain the original highlighting, I then both have to save the cell, but also the color. And just to show it, I want to store both the color and the color index, because as shown here, those two can be separate. And in case that the background color is white, like here, I want to restore that white, but if there's no highlighting, I want to restore that as well. And in that case, the interior color is the same because they are white, but the color index is different. Like before, I need to check if I haven't changed any cell before, which means the values in J1 and K1 are empty. So once again, I first want to check if the value in M2 is equal to -4142, because then I know there's no actual background color. And I could just do a check on color index instead of both color index and color, but for the sake of this example, I want to check both. But in my experimentation, sometimes you can have a difference between color and color index, so if I want a specific color, it might be better to use one or the other. But if M2 is equal to -4142, which means there's no highlighting, it's a normal cell, then I want to change the color of the previous selected cell to be -4142. And if that isn't the case, so the previously selected cell did have a highlighting before I changed it, then I want to use .color, and that value is then stored in L2, which is why I have these headers. Now I've changed the highlighting of the previously selected cell, which means I can change the color of the new cell and write in the new coordinates. So I want to write both the color and the color index of the cell before I change its color. And again, I could use active cell or target in order to reference the cell. And then I can change the color. And lastly, I simply have to write down what the active cell is in order to store that for the next run of the macro.
Keep this in mind.
Since this is a selection change event, I don't have to run it. I can simply select, and we can see that it changes stuff, and the cells I'm highlighting right now don't have any highlighting before.
Oh no!
But if I then select these cells that do have a highlighting, we can see how the color and color index changes. So that had a color index of 2, which isn't the -4142 because I selected the white background color and not no fill. And we can then see that it did not turn. So that's the wonders of doing code live. So it would help if I actually wrote in the column rather than the row. And I changed around whether it was active cell or target, but I don't think it matters here. Yeah, because it would remove highlighting from another cell than the one I previously selected. And I could see that it would often write the same value in J and K. So that was a help here. So that's the benefit of coding live. So if I add different colors here to the C cells, we can see it work properly. So C2 has no color. Now it's blue. Now it's back to white. And now everything works the way I wanted it to. So that's nice and dandy. So